Alright, here we go. We are going to set up an assembly, basically putting all of our parts together. I would recommend opening all of your parts. I've got my blue part, green part, orange, red, and yellow parts available. Already opened up an Inventor. You don't have to, but the reason I'm doing this is because I want to look at the orientation of all those parts and decide which one I want to bring in first. The first part you bring in to an assembly is going to be, you want it to be kind of set up in the way that it's going to go together in the puzzle. So for instance, my red puzzle part, this is exactly the way that I want it situated in my puzzle. My yellow part is kind of leaning over to the side. It's kind of twisted a little bit as to how it's going to go into my puzzle. So I don't want to start with that piece. I'm going to start with my red part. So here's how we create an assembly. I'm going to go to File, New, and I'm not going to click on New. I'm just going to kind of hover over it until these things kind of pop up, and I'm going to click on Assembly. The assembly open up, it'll look exactly like when we were creating our pipe file, except up at the top you'll see this says Assembly 1, and some of the tools look a little bit different. I would recommend that you have looked at the PowerPoint prior to starting this assembly, because you're going to want to understand what a constraint is, as well as what a flush constraint and a mate constraint. Those are the two we're going to be using. So maybe you'll pick it up from here, but I would recommend going back and looking at that presentation from the assignment first. It's going to start with placing our first part. Remember, I want to place the red part. So as I place it, I'm going to navigate down to my Google Drive file stream, my drive, and then in my design processes, I have a Puzzle Cube folder, and I want my red puzzle part to be my starting. It doesn't matter where you drop it, you're just going to left click, and it's going to drop it. It's going to give you another one, so you could drop multiple ones in. We don't want to drop multiple ones in, so I'm going to hit the escape button in the upper left hand corner of the keyboard, and that's going to drop my red part in place. So right off the bat, I noticed that I can see the shading on this, but it's really hard to see the edges unless I'm hovering over the top. So I'm going to show you how we can look at the edges if yours shows up like this. So go to View, View tab, and then Visual Style. I want it to be shaded, but I want the edges to show as well. So shaded with edges. You can click on these things and kind of play around with what these things look like, but I'm going to choose shaded with edges, and now I can see those black lines showing where the different faces are. Okay, time to bring in my next part. So from the view, I want to click back over to my Assemble tab, and I'm going to place another piece. You will know how your puzzle goes together. So I know that when I build my part, I like to use the yellow part second when I'm solving it. So I'm going to open up my yellow part, left click, hit escape, and I'm going to put these two parts together. Holding the shift button down with my left finger, I can push down the wheel and I can rotate these around. That might come in handy here in a little bit. But what I'm going to do is constrain. So I want to constrain, meaning I want these two parts to stick together somehow. So I'm going to click the constrain, and I have two options here. Well, I've got a lot of options up here. I'm going to leave it on that first box. This is kind of our mate flush constraints, and I'm going to choose mate or flush. So basically I'm going to click one face on this part, one face on that part, and I'm going to say I want these two faces to be either flush with one another, in other words, perfectly aligned with one another, or I want them to be mated or stick to each other. So if I was gluing two faces together, I would mate those two faces together. If I was lining up two edges, I would flush constrain those two. So I'm going to mate So I'm going to click this first box. This is mate. If you hover over it, it'll tell you what it is. If you hover over this one, it'll say flush. So I'm going to mate, and mine, I'm going to mate this surface. So I'm going to click this surface, and then I'm going to rotate it around just like I showed you. And I'm going to mate that to this surface. And you'll hear a little click, and now those two things are stuck together almost like with glue. All right, after you mate your two faces together, hit apply. If you don't like, if you made a mistake, you can cancel or do it again, or you can just click on these things before you hit apply. As soon as you hit apply, those two are mated together. Now if I open up my browser over here, and I can see that constraint that I just made. The mate constraint on the yellow is mated to the red one. All right, so there's one constraint. Now I am going to use the flush constraint because I want this edge to line up with the outside of the block on that edge. So I'm going to click my flush, I'm going to click this, and I'm going to click that. And notice how the yellow one is moving around, the red one is standing still. That's because the first piece you bring in will remain stationary, and all the other ones will kind of get aligned to that one. So I'm going to hit apply, and I have one more constraint. So usually when you're constraining a part, you're going to have three different things. I constrained it in this direction with the mate, and then I constrained it in this direction with the flush, and now I got to constrain it in this direction with another flush. I want the bottoms to line up, so I'm going to hit flush, hit this face, that face, and apply. These two pieces are now aligned together, and you can see mate, flush, flush is exactly what I just did. So I'm going to cancel out of here. Make sure you're hitting apply after every one, and then I'm going to bring in my next part. The next part I assemble as my orange piece. I'm going to drop with a left click, hit escape, and then I'm going to put this into position. Okay, I can do a couple different things first. On this particular one, I am going to, well, I will use a flush constraint with the outside of this orange one, and I want it to kind of spin around and be flush with this piece. So you can see how that happened right there. It kind of spun around. Next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to flush the outside here with the outside here. Hit apply. And then I can flush the two top edges. So if you share kind of outside edges, it's real easy just to flush the outside edges with one another. I could, if I wanted to, I could also mate. If I zoomed in, I could mate the inside of that piece to the inside of the yellow piece. But it's just easier to click on these two outside surfaces. So flush, apply, and now I've got my third piece stuck in there just like that. Bring in the next piece. My puzzle, I bring in the green one, open, click, escape, and we'll do this the same way. I'm gonna flush the outside to the outside, hit apply. I'm gonna flush this outside to this outside, hit apply. And now this time I am going to mate the top of the yellow with the bottom of the green. So I'm going to click over on my mate tool. I'm going to hit the top of the yellow and the bottom of the green, and it'll stick it right down into position. There's my fourth piece, and then I'm going to bring in my blue puzzle part. I don't want to bring new, I want to place my blue puzzle part. Sorry. Drop it. Okay, so let's see, how is this one going to look? I'm going to constrain, flush. I know when I solve this that I want that outside piece to be flush with that outside. Hit apply. And you can see how it kind of embedded itself in here, as long as you can see a surface. If you can't see a surface, You can always drag. So if I kind of hover over my blue part, I can kind of drag it around, and it'll always stay flush with the outside because that's the only thing that's constraining it. But I can move it around anywhere else. These two sides will stay flush with one another though, because that's what the blue puzzle part has a constraint on it. So I'm going to do a flush this outside, this outside to this outside, hit apply, and then naturally the top flush with the top, hit apply. So there is my completed puzzle cube. One more thing that you can try, notice when I hit the home button it kind of spins around back into that proper orientation. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and I'm going to do a little test on this thing to see if I have any overlaps going on, to make sure I have it constrained fully and all my parts are going to fit together when I 3D print them. I'm going to go to Inspect, Analyze Interference, and I'm going to just kind of get above my part to the left and drag, so I got this pink box totally going across my whole piece, and I'm going to click OK. So what this says is there were no interferences detected. If you drag across here and it'll say we found one interference or two interferences, as you kind of look on your part, you will be able to see kind of a red kind of overlapping somewhere. So if the blue one and the green one were kind of overlapping one another, we would see like a red kind of area where the two pieces were overlapping. I don't have any of those, so I'm going to move on. If you do, I will show you how to fix that. All right, last thing we need to do is go to File, Save As, and then in your Puzzle Cube folder, this is now going to be an assembly, an IAM file. I'm just going to call this Puzzle Cube Assembly and hit save. Make sure it's going to go back to your Google Drive. All right, that's it.